I want to begin by making a few comments about the way in which Ronald influenced the overall shape and direction of not just the new institutional economics, but in redirecting a lot of attention that had been in limited, narrow economic theory into a broader horizons, which I think he played a major role in doing. I think what Ronald did was to not only elaborate elegantly sources for a theory of the firm that made sense, but he also suggested a completely new way to think about a lot of economics. In fact, he and I gave, hey, you're late. You're supposed to be running this program, young man. Well, you're not now. But Ronald and I both got honorary degrees at the University of Cologne in 1988. And at that, Ronald elaborated his fundamental contributions. And I got up and talked a little bit about the broader implications of what he'd done. And he came to me after and he said, I haven't really thought about all those broader implications. The answer is neither had I. But I think a lot of them have been elaborated and amplified, not only in the sessions that we've had, but generally into what's happened to economics since then. And I think Ronald's contribution to that has been immense. I refer particularly to I don't know what you'd call him, Ronald's protege, because neither Ronald nor he would like that comment. I'm talking about a man who played a major role, though, in expanding and elaborating on Ronald's approach, Stephen Chung. Now, Stephen had a few minor flaws in his character, like not paying his income tax. But beyond that, he probably did more to think through the logic of the whole approach of new institutional economics than anybody else. In particular, and I say this because I think it has been slighted so far in our discussions, he particularly elaborated the importance of transaction costs. And while people have referred all morning long and all afternoon long to transaction costs, first of all, sometimes they've referred to it, I think, incorrectly, and at other times, why they've just slighted it. Transaction costs are, and I quote Stephen Chung, the cost of measuring and enforcing agreements. And when you think about that in its fundamental sense, it incorporates a heck of a lot about what we're concerned with. Later on, I did a study of the size of the transaction sector in the American economy and came out with the fact that in 1970, it was 40% of GNP. In 1870, it had been 25% of GNP, and so it was growing. Not only growing, but obviously a crucial element. And in all the years in which I've traveled around to third world countries, one of the things that stands out right away in any such country is the high cost of transacting in third world countries. So it's something that I think is particularly important, and particularly that requires more work and more effort than we've done so far. I like Sebastian's comments because they focus particularly on things that relate to the transaction sector and the way it could develop. So I think that this is where we ought to go. We've got a long ways to go. But what Ronald did is point us in the right direction. And I must say that in the intervening years since we both got those honorary degrees, I think it's come a long way. That's really what I wanted to say as an introduction. I then want to introduce two eminent speakers. So eminent, in fact, don't speaking when I'm talking about you. He's ignoring me. Thank you. Are you ready? I'm talking about Roger and Bob. both of whom need no introduction as far as their contribution to the way in which institutional economics and economics evolved in the last 25 years. But I think very highly of both of them, even if I give them a bad time. And I do want to, therefore, introduce, which one, do you want to go first?
That's the order of the program.
That's the order. Then I want to introduce Bob Cooter, an old friend, a hiking companion, and someone who has made major contributions in this area. Bob.
All right. In 1972, I was a graduate student at Harvard, and I took the industrial organization course. And at the time, we followed the standard approach at Harvard, which was called structure, conduct, and performance, which many of you will know. This was an approach pioneered by Joe Bain at Berkeley. The idea simply was this, that we could regress the performance of an industry upon its structure, and therefore we need not study the conduct of its firms. For me, this was a bit like serving me the soup and not even letting me smell the main course. At the very end, we got a few words about a paper by Ronald Coase recently discovered, in which internal transactions of the firm were compared to external transactions. After I became aware of that, I did my best to purloin as many of its ideas as I could. So I stop now. Now, I found that in conferences like this, people are at least as interested in my motives for speaking as in what I say. So let me start by saying a few words about the motivation of this paper. I am currently preparing the 6th edition of my textbook with Tom Ulen, which is an introduction to law and economics. And I feel a little bit like the elderly Catholic priest who wakes up one morning and says, maybe Buddha was right. The problem is this. My book, like the others, I think, is essentially comparative statics from front to back. It's the comparative statics of legal rules. Strict liability versus negligence, expectation damages versus reliance damages. Let's compare them with respect to the equilibrium they produce and ask which one's more efficient. And I am suffering a crisis in faith about this approach. And the reason is partly because of this. Somehow, all these years after I took statistics, it's sunk in that if a country grows at 2% a year for a century, it increases 7 times, and if it grows at 10%, it increases 14,000 times. So maybe I've left out something in my book. Now, this contemplating this fact, which has, as I say, has troubled me, is compounded by the fact that I've been keeping the wrong company. I can hear my mother saying to me, Robert, you're going to get in trouble if you keep hanging around with the likes of that Doug North. And that's what I've been doing. And as a consequence, I've come to an appreciation of the potential convergence between institutional economics and growth economics, and what that means for law and economics and for my textbook in particular. Now, when you start thinking about growth instead of comparative statics, it really does change your mental furniture. All these years, I've been carrying around in my head the notion of an X, where supply and demand cross, where we have an equilibrium in the interaction of maximizing buyers and sellers. And I've tried to force that analysis into as many spheres as I can. I sometimes tell the students at the beginning of my class the answer is marginal benefit equals marginal cost. We'll spend the semester investigating the questions. Well, when you start thinking about growth economics, I don't think you can think of it that way. I don't think law and growth economics has that structure. I think the more fundamental idea than equilibrium is what goes on in disequilibrium. That's where all the action is. And when you're out of equilibrium, probably, I kind of think that the basic analytical concept is that of a cycle of innovation. If you want to put it in terms of a concrete image rather than an X, it's a gyre. It's something that goes around where an innovation is made, it's developed, it becomes profitable, it loses its profitability, and it's replaced. But as you complete the cycle, you're at a higher level than you were before. That seems to me to be the fundamental framework that I'm trying to switch to and carry around in my mind. It's also the case that I have to give up the idea that perfect competition is the ideal. And the reason is, quite simply, that in the cycle of innovation, if there's perfect competition, there's no innovation. Because in order to have innovation, you have to have supernormal profits for a while, not just to compensate you for your initial investments, but also to motivate you to go into the business in the first place and take the enormous risk that's involved. We're not talking about production functions. We're talking about activities where most people fail. Most people lose money. I myself went into business, and I've had some success, but I can remember waking up in the middle of the night and saying, I'm going to have to call my relatives and tell them I lost their money. This is not a good feeling, and you don't submit to that for a normal rate of return. So I have to give up the idea that competition is the aim, perfect competition is the aim, and instead to think about something like optimizing temporary monopoly or something like that. So this is a big change. I certainly have not carried it out in this. I will not be carrying it out in the 6th edition of Cooter and Ullin. That's much too hard, although I hope that I can start to move in that direction. And part of that start is a book that is going to be published by Princeton University Press. They're going to begin publishing it as soon as they have the manuscript, and that will be soon. It's supposed to come out next year. And this is a book that I've written about law and growth economics in developing countries. I've given it the modest subtitle, How Law Can End the Poverty of Nations, basically because I want it to be read. I'm trying to write a book that is accessible to many people, and if you looked at the piece that I uploaded to the web, you may have thought it was awfully simplistic, but I hope that it's also accessible. Now let me explain the central image in the book, the central image, which is Solomon's Knot. Solomon's Knot is literally, it's King Solomon, and it's sometimes called Solomon's Knot of Wisdom because it's a way of tying two loops together in such a way that they're extremely strong. This is one of many images of it. You can find it on the 3,000-year-old tiles, or you can find it on the port at Genoa today. And you are also a venture capitalist, as they are, putting your money into the company, being paid in shares. And you're arranging for other venture capitalists to be paid in shares, well, then in that case, you have to have enough of the ownership such that it's better for you to make this company succeed and work than it is to take whatever private information they have, whatever secrets they have that are of value, and put them to work in another firm that you might control completely yourself. Similarly, the entrepreneurs have got to expect to make more money by developing the business than by appropriating the investor's money. If they can make more money by appropriating the investor's money, why go through the agony of trying to innovate? Why not just steal it? So that's a characterization of the abstract conditions that have to be solved, and the question is, how do you do it? Well, first of all, the innovator and the investor have to contract with each other, but these contracts are necessarily incomplete. There are too many non-contractable acts where the information is imperfect and can't be observed. We're all familiar with this idea. For example, in the startup phases of a firm, it requires a tremendous amount of effort from the parties, which is unobservable and therefore not contractable. Now, as we all know, organizations can ameliorate incomplete contracts in a variety of ways, facilitating monitoring, providing a framework for repeated transaction, creating an exclusion penalty, such as paying an efficiency wage to someone so they want to stay in the business. So organizations are going to be essential to trying to create innovation by solving the double trust dilemma, since contracts are necessarily going to be incomplete. Now, the solution to the problem, I think, also necessarily involves the participation of both parties in the governance of the corporation. I think that shared governance aspect of it is what makes the entity that's created a true organization rather than only in an organizational form. Now, there are certain constraints on any organization that's going to be in the area of remuneration, that's going to be in the area of innovation that we need to keep in mind. And one of these constraints is that the innovators and investors have to receive a share of the profits. They can't be remunerated in another way, such as by bonds, by fixed payments. And that's simply because where there's real innovation involved, the risk is so enormous that you can't burden the firm with some kind of fixed repayment that would be high enough to cover the bankruptcy risk. So you really have to remunerate with a share of future profits. And of course, that's going to be enormously problematic because distributing profits is a law-intensive activity, and where there isn't good law, there's not going to be confidence about the shares of profits that the parties will receive. In addition, it's enormously important that the innovators can sell and exit the firm early because if they can't sell and exit the firm, then their portfolios remain agonizingly painfully unbalanced, and after they've made a lot of money, they really want to secure it and not do that. Now, this then leads to an explanation of the organization in England of the 17th century spice trade, which is most interesting because it precisely parallels the situation in Silicon Valley. The situation in England is roughly the following, according to Ron Harris's work on the subject. In a port in the south of England, some sea captain and his friends would propose a voyage to East Asia to come back with spices. This voyage would take 2 to 4 years. The ship would have to be entirely outfitted at very great cost, much more cost than the captain and a few of his friends could pay for. In addition, the captain and his friends had many secrets. It was a big secret to know how to get to Indonesia. It was a big secret to know who you could deal with once you got to Indonesia. It was replete with private information. And, of course, it was extremely risky because the Dutch pirates preyed on the English pirates preyed on the Dutch, and everybody else preyed on the Dutch and the English. So it was an extremely risky business, and, of course, it was enormously profitable. If you came back with a ship loaded with spices, you could really make a lot of money. Now, in order to solve the double trust problem in this case, they invented the joint stock corporation, it's a dispute exactly when it was invented, but they certainly brought it to a new level. The parties who invested in the venture were shareholders entitled to a share of the profits. And one of the most interesting facts about these voyages is that when the ship returned to port successfully, if it succeeded, the people in the town would see it coming and they'd immediately flock down to the dock. And the reason they would flock to the dock is because when they got there, the company was going to be dissolved. Because it would hold a general meeting, divide up the cargo among the shareholders, and then cease to exist. So this, to me, is so precisely the pattern in Silicon Valley, it's really uncanny. And it also shows a very important fact to my thesis, because when I talk about innovation as driving economic growth, people say, oh yeah, well, technological innovation is especially, maybe exclusively, the domain of rich countries. And your theory can't apply to poor countries, to developing countries. And of course, that's quite wrong, because the point is that the most important innovations that occur in developing countries are innovations in markets and organization. They're not new scientific discoveries or technological discoveries. Those take labs and good universities. They're innovations in markets and organizations. But that's what this was. The 17th century spice trade was an innovation in markets and organizations that had all the characteristics of innovation in Silicon Valley, and therefore the model applies to it. Now, in Silicon Valley, there is this interesting phenomenon that I refer to as 3 stages of finance. And the first stage is relational finance, which is the 3 F's, friends, family, and fools. And indeed, most Silicon Valley firms start out with the investors not really able to understand at all what is going to be done. What they can understand is, what they know is about the people who are proposing to do it. And it's the confidence in that relationship that very often enables the initial capital to be assembled to begin the development process. Now, once the product has been brought to the point where it has demonstrable qualities, at that point, usually private investment occurs. And by private investment, I mean people like venture capitalists who are not your friends or your family or your fools. They're specialists in the early stages of finance. They're specialists in evaluating a company like yours and taking enormous risk. And with them, you will have private contracts, which are supported, especially by the courts, and lack the kind of relational foundation that exists when you borrow from your friends and your family. And of course, at the exit stage, we have a public finance where the corporation has succeeded, and there's either an initial public offering or it's acquired by a public corporation. Ron Gilson has argued that the what I'm calling public finance is necessary to venture capital, that you can't have venture capital unless you can have an exit of the kind that's created by IPOs. And if you don't have IPOs, if you can't have IPOs, as much of the world can't, then you're not going to have a proper venture capital industry. Now, notice that what happens here is that you have a relational capital, and then you have relational and private capital, and then you have relational and private and public. It doesn't. None of them necessarily goes away as the firm progresses, nor does it go away as the economy develops. It's to say there is this rather remarkable fact that the stages of finance in Silicon Valley bear a certain relationship to the development of finance in developing countries. As we move from relational to private to public, the system is becoming much more law-intensive. It requires good law in order to make it work. At the relational level, you can get by with pretty weak law. And in those countries where the law is weakest, we observe relational finance and relational contracting. We don't observe private contracts that rely on enforcement in courts or court-like bodies. At the next stage, many countries are able to enforce contracts effectively, and as a consequence, they can have a vigorous private finance of economic innovation, but they can't master a public market. They can't master a public market that's effective because they have not created the corporate law that will protect outsiders from insiders. If you invest in a Russian corporation as an outsider, I can hardly imagine why you would do that, because the insiders will expropriate you when it's convenient for them to do so, and you should be apprised of that fact. So what we have is that we have these 3 stages in Silicon Valley which bear a certain relationship to the situation in developing countries, that ideally you have relational and private and public finance combining, but when the legal institutions are too weak, you may not have public markets at all, or you may have, but you may have private contracting for shares, and if the institutions are even weaker than that, then you may simply be stuck with relational finance. Okay, now I want to say the material that I've distributed to you is on corporations. It's pretty simplistic, but I hope it's deep in making the connection with the double trust problem and with the problem of growth. The book itself covers all the standard topics in law and economics, property, contracts, finance, corporation, bankruptcy, torts, etc. So, and in each case, I'm trying to work through the consequences of a growth perspective on the formation of institutions that are involved, and I'm trying to show how the law supports those institutions and makes them possible. I haven't had a time to explain to you what I think of as the decisive advantage of corporations, but it's quite straightforward. The decisive advantage of corporations is seen if we go back to the constraints on financing extremely risky enterprises. And they are, first of all, that the parties have to get a share of the profits, that you can't deal with, say, fixed interest arrangements. And in addition, you need to be able to, the founders need to be able to exit from the company. And it's very difficult to accomplish those things by another form other than the corporate form. So the essential claims of the book are that sustained growth in developing countries occurs through innovation, especially in markets and organizations, as opposed to technology. That innovation poses a problem of trust between the innovator with ideas and the financier with capital, and the best solutions necessarily involve the law. Okay. All right, well, thank you, Mike. You asked about the... Well, first of all, let me say a couple preliminaries about China. China is sometimes pointed to as the proof that the proposition that law is important to growth must be false. And that's said to be the case because the Chinese court system is very weak. It's not a very reliable enforcer of property of contracts. And yet we have the growth miracle of the age occurring in China. I think, in fact, this is exactly wrong. That law, if you're talking about a growth theory, you need to look at the vector, not just the value of the function. And I think that there is no place in the world where law improved more between 1970 and, say, 1985 than in China. I mean, law was simply, in the Cultural Revolution, it was abandoned. So first of all, I'd like to say that I think China is a good proof and not disproof of the hypothesis that I want to make. Now, another point about China is that it's often said that China proves that if you mean by law what's enforced by the courts, then it's not necessary to growth. That in fact, China has found ways of protecting property and contracts reasonably well through much more government-intensive administrative methods. And I think that's correct. I think that we should look at the problem of the double trust problem and how the double trust problem is solved in terms of the, first of all, what I call the property principle of growth, which is that people who create wealth should be able to keep much of it. Without that condition, you're not going to have wealth creation. You can secure that through courts, but you can also secure it through other administrative means. Yeah, I'm sorry.
China less than for make
Go
it
ahead.
Iran, make it some other place with a stable,
Yeah.
place that you pay off.
Okay, what's your question? Then restate your question.
My question is, if you successfully can invest in a country by giving someone in government, usually in a dictatorship, a piece of the business, which involves at one level sharing your investment in return for quote nothing. What you're actually getting is what we call protection.
Sure.
And my question only is simply how that fits the model.
Well, I have no problem with that at all. I talk about alternative means of enforcing the principles of growth for property and for contracts. And I think there's a natural monopoly on force, and so it tends to be the case that the state evolves as a single supplier of the threat of force as a way of enforcing these rights. But it's also the case that, like every monopolist, the state abuses its position. So I think that, on the one hand, the state is necessary to go beyond relational finance, to have the enforcement of contracts, to have public markets. But I also think that the state, I think that the danger of expropriation by the state is always present. And we have to look at the institutions that constrain that and cause the state to take the viewpoint of the stationary bandit rather than the roving bandit, to use Mensur Olson's terms. Sorry, I've gone on too long, Mike, but that was a great question.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up on that, because one of the questions we want to ask is not only how you get yourself into a favorable equilibrium for development, but what it is that you can do to get yourself out of that into a situation where you return to a form of banditry. And one of the things that's quite striking about modern America, you find that going on all the time today with the increase of what is sometimes called exactions of permits as conditions to going forward with respect to development. So that you find very common, I'm just curious what your reaction is. If you want to build a large project in New York City, and there are all the community boards that can veto you, and in further stages of the process, so what you do is you promise them basically 5% of the deal in the form of a construction of a new school for the community, which doesn't have to be funded out of general revenues, and then they're the guys who want interference for you trying to push the whole thing through. And in a strong property rights system, there'd be no permit abuse who would pay that kind of stuff. But in a weak property rights system, that seems to be the way in the United States that you get some development done and what heavy the local regulations and more powerful the situation. We're going up the other side of the ladder. Do you also see exactions before you get to this, so that you kind of have this fragile peak in the middle? You pass the exaction game before you get back into it on the other side, or do you not see that sort of technique used? This is to handle Michael's question of how it is that you manage to get the state to be a partner. And this is the case by basically giving them an explicit allocation against the firm revenue.
Yeah, yes, okay. Well, we spend quite a bit of time talking about the difference between making and taking, and the important role of the state in creating incentives to make rather than to take, including incentives so that it doesn't take. So I think the problem that you've described is of course quite central to our concerns. And I think the kind of anti-commons problem that you're describing in New York City really is a problem of the United States, a very corrosive one. So I would share your concern about that matter. Now, as far as an analysis of the state, how you constrain the state, how you get the... that's not the central focus of our book. Our central focus of our book is on the double trust problem and how it gets solved. Nevertheless, we do have a chapter on reform at the end. And in the chapter on reform, what we try to talk about is what we call Pareto reforms, that is to say reforms where hardly anybody loses and everybody goes up. And then the question is, what are the conditions under which people will perceive a change as being a Pareto reform rather than a redistributive reform? And I think that's fundamental.
Your focus is on the institutional arrangement of the call, the contracts, and the firm, whatever that might be. But one of the things that was left out in the discussion, probably isn't left out of the book, is the social setting in the sense of having a fair playing field for competition to work. That is, if you don't have competition between these various pockets of combinations of investors and innovators, we don't know exactly where the system's going to go. Now, once you say that, we have to become suspicious of the productivity of having the state be a partner in this arrangement. Because the state, by its very nature, is not specialized as these investor institutions are specialized to a particular activity, a particular way of doing it. And the state is covering a whole variety of institutions and doesn't have the same kind of testing mechanism of competitive markets. So I don't see how you could leave competitive markets out of this process.
Well, I don't want to leave competitive markets out of the process. I think that temporary monopoly is necessary to innovation and growth, and permanent monopoly kills innovation and growth just as effectively as permanent enduring competition does. You have to have supernormal profits, but they have to be eroded. It's the dissipation of the supernormal profit. It's their erosion that's evidence of the diffusion of the innovation in the economy that's raising everybody's productivity and making the society richer. So we must have competitive pressures at work in order to make the innovation, in order to drive the innovative process. I can say quite a bit more, but I think I'll stop.
I'm going to take the third swing at Richard and Michael.
Okay.
Okay, you have just...
You imply I missed twice.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I think you went to the question.
Yeah.
The rapacious dictator of Lower Slavonia has just agreed to hire you as a consultant. The trouble with Lower Slavonia is that rapacious military dictator woke up about a week ago and decided that the rapacious military dictator business was pretty boring, and he really wanted to be the founder of a great, successful, rapidly growing economy, but nobody believes him. What are the steps that you would recommend that he take that would cause this virtuous circle of trust relationships all of a sudden to begin to blossom in a country where nobody has ever trusted anybody for the last 1,000 years?
Okay, well, that's a great question. I think we should distinguish between distrust of the government and distrust of your business partners. One of the things we know from this really incredible wealth of new anthropological data where trust games are being played in different kinds of societies is that among, to take a concrete example, nomadic herders in Kenya who participate only remotely in markets have a lot less trust than people in small towns in Missouri. So even though they're embedded in personal relationships, even though they spend most of their time interacting with their relatives, for some reason they don't trust each other when they play these trust games. So there's a problem of there's a micro problem of trust, of distrust in countries without a mercantile tradition. Now, there's another problem, which is distrust of the dictator. The problem of, or distrust of the state in general. And here, this is really not just a problem of dictators. And the reason is quite simply this. Congress cannot pass a law whose terms include the provision that a future Congress can't repeal it. That term is not going to be enforceable. So it's very difficult to make political deals that stick with commitment because it's part of the political process that whatever is done through the political sphere can be undone by a future politician. So I think that's a problem of politics. That is true in different kinds of political orders. Now, sometimes you see this dictator's problem that you described in an extreme case. I think Pinochet is a case of that. Because Pinochet, everybody wanted to cut a deal where Pinochet would resign his military authoritarian power in exchange for which he would not be prosecuted. But of course, there was no way of committing not to prosecuting him once he'd given up his power. And so, indeed, he was in the course of being prosecuted when he died. That's an example of the kind of commitment problem that you have in mind. Suppose a dictator wants to agree to cease being rapacious. About the only way he can commit is to decentralize some of his power to share it with others. But if he does that, what's going to ensure that the deal that was struck sticks and that he's not persecuted? Well, I can pose the question, Roger, but it's not the central problem of the book, and so I can't go further than that in answering it.
Well, I think we ought to thank Robert.
I apologize for the nature of the slides because we all prepared extensive topical outlines for Ronald, so he would know what the conference was about. And I don't want to do that. So I'm going to turn it off and on, so you don't have to look at the topical outline. All you have to do is look at the things that really should be slides, which are data. So what is the story of this paper? The story of this paper basically is about a project that I've been concerned about forever, and it arose from being involved in some World Bank missions starting over 20 years ago, where the task was World Bank collects a group of people to go tell some developing country how to privatize their state-owned enterprises, how to create competition in formerly state-owned enterprise monopoly industries like telecommunications, and what do you tell them, and how do you know that what you're saying to them has any truth value? Now, so that's the genesis of it. There's a second genesis as well, which is that there's a fairly extensive literature in economics that attempts to be about the role of institutions in this or that. And one very narrow topic can be something of the following form. How does the performance of the telecommunications industry depend on the regulatory institutions and the structure of the industry, for example? So in this kind of literature, you collect data on a bunch of countries, and you regress things like the penetration of the telephone system as the dependent variable on other things such as do they have a competitive telecommunications wireless industry? Did they auction the spectrum, and did they award it to political cronies? Do they have an independent regulator? A whole series of these variables. And the trouble with this, of course, is that you're regressing endogenous variables on endogenous variables, and it's hard to know what the regressions mean. And let me give you as an illustration something that is a fact about this literature. Suppose that instead of putting the performance of the telecommunications industry on the left-hand side of the equation, what I do is put the 5-year-long or 10-year-long moving average rate of economic growth, real economic growth, on the left-hand side. And I'll start off with the premise of a paper that I once read, prepared by a consultant for a country about why they should privatize their telephone company, which was all these regulatory variables that I just talked to you about in the telecommunications industry specifically were the variables to explain rates of economic growth. And lo and behold, the answer was, you will be able to grow at 3% per year faster if you just liberalize your telecommunications industry. Replace a state-owned monopoly with a reasonably competitive industry where you have 4 or 5 carriers, and there's no monopoly at any stage of the industry. There's no access monopoly, there's no long-distance monopoly, there's no international monopoly. And imbue this industry with an independent regulatory commission that uses spectrum auctions to create the wireless carriers. And lo and behold, you're going to grow at 3% a year more than you otherwise would. And then there's another set of literatures which says, well, if this must, these are people who didn't get started as telecommunications nuts like me. They're just interested in regulation in general. So they would say, well, I'm not interested in telecom. I'm interested in the whole infrastructure sector. So I'm going to apply this. I'm going to create the same basic variables for the right-hand side variables for electric utilities, for transportation, for all of the infrastructure, for water, and come up with an index of the degree to which the country has obeyed the dictates, the recommendations that flow from neoclassical economic theory to structure these industries, and see what we get. And lo and behold, we get the same 3 percentage points. Well, that tells you what the problem is, right? That what these variables you've got on the right-hand side are stalking horses for something much more fundamental. And it may well be what Bob is trying to study. It may well be something else about the political system. It may be any host of series of institutional characteristics that end up being the true underlying characteristics that cause a country to decide to liberalize its telecommunications industry, to privatize its electric utilities, to allow a competitive transportation sector to replace a state-owned monopoly. In other words, something else at a deeper level is giving you that extra 3%. And when you just stick in the telecommunications indicators, you, of course, make a false inference in going from telecommunications reform to economic growth. Because for the World Bank advisors to be successful, to convince people that they ought to liberalize their telecommunications industry, something else has to be going on inside the country that would cause them to want to listen to you in the first place. And so this is what since we're always big, all of us today have been really big on where do these papers come from. That's the first part of where they came from. And the second part of where they came from is my early encounters with Ronald Coase and Doug North. And I warned Doug that I was going to reference his stuff, but I didn't tell him what the adjectives and adverbs were going to be. So go backwards to my very first article in a journal was actually an article that was a comment on a paper by someone who shall remain nameless called Spectrum Allocation Without Markets. And the idea that this person had was that Ronald Coase had a great idea in 1959. It's just that it's impossible. So how can we take the ideas about what an efficient spectrum auction would actually look like and redo the FCC's beauty contest allocation system so that it produces the same result? And of course, if you read that paper really carefully, you realize that if you can invent an administrative procedure that mimics the market outcome, you can create the market. That was the whole point of that paper. And roughly simultaneously, I met Doug, because he was at the time beginning to write a book with Lance Davis on the role of institutions in growth. And we had a series of conversations. In order for Doug and I to have serious conversations about economics, the very first thing we had to find out about each other is we both loved wine. And for the first hour and a half, we talked about wine. And then we got on to the economics, because at that time, Doug was a part owner of a winery in Washington. And so we found out that we loved wine, and two guys who love wine must have the same basic ideas about how institutions affect growth. So that book was the other sort of institutional, certainly the other inspiration for wanting to think about this problem. And those things all happened about 40 years ago. So this is the consequence of 40 years of thinking about this problem. Now, the beauty of it all is, of course, that it's liberating to know that you're going to go out and collect a lot of data about a lot of countries, but you're not going to run a regression. All right? And I recommend this to you as one of the great things about trying to understand institutions is that what you're not really looking for the coefficient on an independent regulatory agency on economic growth, because you know that's a meaningless coefficient. What you're really looking for is what later on, 25 years later, Bob Bates and Avner Greif called analytic narratives, right? What you're really doing is learning a lot in detail about the institutions in a country so you can actually say something interesting comparatively. Now, the problem is you can't really test a hypothesis and you can't really be scientific about cause and effect relationships. What you can hope to do is something that we hate to admit we actually do, but we actually do it, which is try to induce the common patterns from these things by reading them. Now, Ronald actually said this when the Institutional Economics Society was created. I never get the name right. ISNI. What a ridiculous. You know Doug was involved to come up with an acronym like that, right? ISNI. Sounds like a disease. But in any case, when this organization was created, he basically said what I just said, that what you really need to do is go study the institutions carefully. What he didn't say is, if you want to develop a data set for 20 different countries so you can do something comparative about how institutions affected performance in this particular industry, you're going to spend a year or two per country figuring it all out. And so that's why this project is so long in the gestation and why nothing really has come of it to this date. So what you're going to see is a working long-term process that was started roughly 20 years ago. It's led to a lot of dead ends and only a couple of papers. I hope that this one is not one of the dead ends. So let's go back to the thing you heard right from the beginning, which is wireless telephony is one of the great success stories in the world. 4.5 billion wireless telephones right now in the world. Compare that to 1.3 billion wireline telephones. That is to say, this is an industry that is now more than 3 times as big as the wireline telephone industry. Moreover, if you take away Western Europe and North America, and Japan, which have fully developed wireline carriers, unlike the rest of the world, the ratio in the developing world in many of these countries is more like 10 to 1. That is to say, the wireline telecommunications industry in most of the world is simply going to be bypassed. It's never going to happen. And wireless is the telecommunications technology of choice. So that's the first observation. And it's true ubiquitously down to the poorest countries. You can observe in countries with very low per capita income, in the range of $1,000 to $2,000, wireless telephone penetration rates in the range of 50% or even higher. That is to say, the number of wireless telephones divided by the population equals 1/2. Why did this all happen? Well, we know why it happened in a very generic sense. That is, generally good, and I have a big footnote here, but not better than good. I know I'm at Chicago, and I know that government can never be better than good. But in general, we sort of got this one right compared to most things we do. And the reason it's mostly right, mostly good, is because, first of all, the industry is mostly, though not completely, privatized. It's mostly, but not completely, competitive. That is to say, most countries we observe multiple firms, which is 3 or more, competing with each other to get customers. Most countries, but not all, but nearly all, we observe the permission of foreign ownership of carriers, so that very poor countries haven't created a barrier to generating the capital necessary to build this capital-intensive industry. We observe relatively narrow and targeted regulation. We don't observe ubiquitous management of the industry by the government. We observe some regulation, and some of it not all that well thought out. But in general, it tends to be narrow and targeted, so it doesn't prevent the industry from being healthy. And also, this is an important part, given that we're at a conference celebrating Ronald Coase, the licenses are transferable. For the most part, they're tradable. And indeed, we have a number of examples that I'm going to discuss very briefly about countries that got the initial allocation and creation of the industry wrong, but because the licenses were tradable, it managed to rationalize itself simply through private sector transactions. Okay, now, what are the countries that I'm interested in? This is the complete sample of countries that Bob Hope and Bing Crosby made a road picture of. No, that's not actually right. It's close. This is the set of countries that range in population from 10 million up, that have a per capita purchasing power parity in 2008 of GDP between the lowest one, which you can see as the red up there, is $7,800, and the highest is Mexico, $14,300. And the lowest population is Tunisia, with a little bit over 10 million. The biggest country is Brazil, with about 200 million. Now, I'm not sure that this way of segregating the countries matters. In fact, I'm a little bit worried that the small countries are too small. But for reasons that you shall see, I just couldn't give up Cuba. And once I'd had Cuba in there, I had to add a couple more, because Cuba is fascinating. So you may not have thought of Cuba as an intermediate level of development country, but it is. And it isn't really a terribly poor country. So then the second feature that I want to show to you, get this right. Here is the facts that we are trying to explain. These are the facts that we are trying to explain, which is the main telecommunications indicators of all of these countries. And as you can see, fortunately, we have a substantial amount of variance to explain. And this to me is by far the most interesting slide. If I had done it for the rich countries, it wouldn't be anywhere near as interesting. There wouldn't be anywhere near as much variation in the penetration and in the usage. This is truly a spectacular wide range of variation. And as you can see, there are several countries in which there are more telephones than people, more wireless telephones than people. Actually, if we were to look at wireline plus wireless, we would find that in advanced industrialized economies, there are more telephones than people, but there aren't more wireless telephones than people. Like in the United States, we only have enough wireless telephones for everybody over the age of age 7 to have one. We don't have enough for everybody from the day 1 to have one. But as you can see, in four or five of these countries, or 4 of these countries rather, we have more wireless telephones than people. And by and large, these tend to be countries with very low penetration of wireline telephony. And so one explanatory variable for these numbers is, of course, wireline penetration. And I'm not going to bother with that one. Just take it on faith. That doesn't do it. That doesn't explain this variation. We're still left with enormous amounts of variation. And the reason for it is, unlike in the developed economies, there's no country on this list that has a wireline penetration of more than about 20% of its population, and most of them are down around 10. So for this, the nice thing about this sample of countries is that looking at wireless penetration by itself basically is almost all of the story about what the variation is. With regard to mobile usage, all of these numbers are low compared to advanced industrialized economies. As you can well imagine, I bet you know which country in the world has the highest per capita minutes of use of wireless telephony. Which one do you think it is? The U.S., by a factor of 2. All right, and the reason, of course, is the slide that was shown earlier about spectrum auctions. We have off-scale the cheapest prices for talking on wireless telephony. And I'll explain to you why we do. But even in countries that have institutional arrangements that sort of look like these, the minutes of use is above the highest one here, which is Romania, which is around 300. Europe is typically in the range of 350 to 450. So Romania looks sort of like Europe, but nobody else does. And then the last column isn't really accurate. It's called prices because that's what the World Bank calls it. The last column is taken from the communications facts that are put out annually by the World Bank. What it actually is the monthly cost of a fixed bundle of goods, which includes an amortization of the installation cost, the getting in price. You know, as you know, in the U.S., when you buy a cell phone from AT&T, you're not actually paying the full retail price. They're charging really less than that, and then they're putting some of that into the monthly charge. So you take the amortized initial fee plus the monthly rate plus a combination of local calls, domestic and long-distance calls, and international calls that is representative of this category of countries in general, and then that's what the final column is. And when you look at the variation there, the source of the variation is partly in the installation and monthly charge, but the main source of it is differences in usage prices across countries, where you have, in the U.S., the de facto price is even lower than the 6-cent price. Most people actually have a zero marginal cost of usage because we have these strange plans where you buy large numbers of minutes and almost nobody uses all the minutes that they buy. So the marginal cost of a local telephone call to most wireless users in the United States is zero. Yeah. So I'm almost there. And so this is an intriguing result. And let me now go to the next important fact, which is motivated the selection of countries. Income is not the cause of the difference. All right? That is to say, income isn't the answer. And I didn't plan it this way. Notice the bottom 2 and the top 2. We have Argentina. I'm sorry for you guys in Chicago. Those nasty socialists in Argentina are beating Chile in terms of penetration. They're not beating them by a lot, but they have a little bit higher income and they have a higher penetration rate. But the intriguing thing is that Argentina and Algeria have exactly the same penetration rate with almost a factor of 2 difference in income. The highest income country, Mexico, has a lower penetration rate than the very bottom country, which is Ecuador. And so that income isn't the explanation. If you actually do the regression of penetration on income, you get a positive coefficient because all the guys over 100 are in the top half. But the reality is, it isn't income that's explaining this. And in particular, the Iran case, which is about in the middle, and the Mexico case are really important things to explain. Okay, so this kills off an hour. Now let me tell you a few stories about how we explain this. The very first idea, which is that this is a Coase conference, is to try to figure out what the auctions do. About half of these countries have held spectrum auctions of one form or the other. The first mechanism to hold a spectrum auction is you just hold a spectrum auction. But the second is you grant a license to state-owned enterprises, and you have multiple state-owned enterprises, and then you sell the companies. So you're indirectly selling the companies by virtue of having an auction for those. And about the other half just use the standard beauty contest allocation mechanism, where, and in those countries, it's basically corrupt. To give you a flavor, in Malaysia, the first 3 licensees were the president of the majority party, the prime minister, and the finance minister. They got the first 3 companies. They very quickly, in a nice Coase 1960 fashion, sold their companies to other people in the private sector, and they became very successful. So one lesson from, if we combine Coase 1960 with Coase 1959, auctions are a good mechanism if you structure them correctly and have multiple firms, but they're not necessary. And if you, in fact, compare the countries that had graft and corruption as the mechanism for awarding the spectrum licenses versus those that used auctions, you don't get a particularly interesting result. There is one, however, that gets you a good result, and then, Doug, I'm going to be done with a series of questions. All I got to do is find the silly... There we go. The second thing you can do is create competitive industry. And at the bottom is the average, right? Which is that if you have a single dominant carrier, which is, and it's not, it doesn't matter whether it's a state-owned enterprise or a former state-owned enterprise that was privatized to monopoly or privatized to de facto monopoly because its dominance was guaranteed in terms of the regulatory institutions that were created for it. If that's what you have, either a dominant state-owned enterprise, then excluding the basket cases, which are Cuba and Iran, all right, if you exclude Cuba and Iran, which have really low, you still have a 10 percentage point difference in penetration. But interestingly enough, that isn't good enough to explain all the variance. Indeed, if you ran this regression, you'd find that competition was highly significant, but it would be because of Cuba and Iran. Now, I might add that Iran presents a problem for us because they did have an auction. They had 2 kinds of auctions. The first was the selling of a state-owned one of the 2 state-owned enterprise wireless carriers, and the other was then a third wireless carrier was created. There's one tiny little problem. The first state-owned enterprise was, quote, privatized to the Iranian Guard, the Revolutionary Guard, and the third one was privatized to the then President Rafsanjani. And so, you know, it's hardly fair to call that a competitive industry where you have, at the time of creation, the Army owns one, the Ministry of Communications owns one, and the President owns one. That's not quite what we had in mind when we recommended privatization. But if we look across these countries in general, we definitely find, well, Algeria didn't really do what we recommended, and they're paying for it. I mean, excuse me, Iran didn't do it, and Cuba, of course, is hanging in there. They have a government state-owned monopoly happily with their less than 3% penetration. The rest of them are not so great. And let me just briefly summarize for you. The top four, in terms of the over 100% penetration, all have three or more independent private carriers. Now, there's a footnote to that. Venezuela is in this category, and in 2007, one of the carriers was renationalized. So now they have three private carriers and one nationalized carrier. So we'll wait and see what happens in Venezuela. It's possible that they will blow this. And likewise, in Malaysia, they have multiple carriers, the smallest of which is a state-owned enterprise. That is to say, the government state-owned enterprise is a failure, but they haven't actually put a bullet in its head yet. We have unsuccessful complete privatizations in Brazil, Mexico, and Peru, all of which have 3+ carriers. All have been privatized for more than 10 years, and their penetrations are all low relative to the norm for this group, which is 90 or more. All right? We have successful, large state-owned enterprises in an industry with a private presence. All right? This is Algeria with 93%, Colombia with 91%, Kazakhstan with 97%, where this is sort of an interesting case in that one entity is owned by the government, another entity is owned by the military, and the third one is fully privatized, and they have achieved a competitive outcome. Prices are relatively low, penetration is high. And then we have state-owned enterprises with a private presence that also are not successful, equal in number: Ecuador, Tunisia, and Turkey. So what we get from all this is that it's not true that the auction mechanism explains very much, and it's not true that competition by itself explains very much. It's except for the fact that the very best ones are competitive. All right. So that's the current state of play. Now, that's the final bottom line as to what is going to explain this. What is going to explain it is the details of the institutional arrangements by which the carriers were created. And in particular, the crucial issue is how you deal with the pricing of termination of wireless calls. One reason that you observe multiple wireless carriers per adult is that in some countries, the mechanism of terminating access charge is prices are negotiated among the carriers. And so what they do is set a cartel price for termination. And that means that the cost of calling from company A to company B is extremely high. But they compete with each other on the basis of promising low prices, competitive prices, for termination on their own network. So one reason that most of my friends in Mexico carry around 2 or 3 cell phones in their pocket is because the difference between the terminating access fee on multiple company calls versus within company calls can be a factor of 3 or 4 in the price. So here, in a sense, we get additional penetration that is a waste, that's coming about from a bad set of regulatory institutions about how you do pricing. I don't have all the data yet. I cannot tell you that this is going to explain the differences between the ones here that have competition but not good results versus competition and good results. But so far, I know it's true for a couple of bad ones, like Mexico being the obvious case in point. And I also know that there is not this cartelization of termination in some of the good ones, like, for example, our friend Kazakhstan. So it looks like that matters, and that's going to end up with it. But wait for the Journal of Law and Economics issue that comes out a year from now to find out the final answer.
He'll take questions now.
Parallel to the story you're telling, you told about the transformation from railroads to automobile transportation to the internal combustion engine. In the sense that both railroads and land the switch to cell phones can operate with a much more primitive infrastructure. I mean, you can drive around in dirt roads as well as and similarly, you might expect that countries that have competition, a lot of competitive providers of vehicles, internal combustion engines, would have great penetration in those. And also, socialist countries that have state monopolies have extremely tiny percentage of people that own cars. The quality is terrible, and access is restricted. And countries that are capitalistic or have market systems, car companies have much higher percentage penetration. So I realize the analogy is not perfect, but it seems like there may be some commonalities there that certain technologies that require extremely complicated large-scale integrated enterprises require different institutional arrangements than those that are much more decentralized.
I think the second part of the story about the degree to which there's automobilization or
Okay, it's on. The automobilization seems to probably be true, but most of these countries we're actually looking at do not have intensive automobilization. And so that's an advantage of looking at this level of development, that you're going to find relatively low rates of automobile ownership. But I think the other point is interesting in the following sense, that it's not quite the same as the transportation story, because whereas the fixed capital investment required for wireline telephony is large relative to wireless telephony if you forget the receiver itself. The receiver itself and the cell station is much more complicated than the receiver and the switch in a wireline telephone network. And the coordination required in order to have compatibility between the telephone and the switch is much greater. And then it's got to work across networks, and because of roaming. That one of the things I didn't talk about is that one of the policy decisions a country has is whether there's mandatory roaming. Mandatory roaming means if I'm in my own calling area, I'm automatically hooked to my own carrier. But if I'm in an area where my carrier doesn't have service, I hook to somebody else. And automatic roaming is required in almost all of these countries, and it's required in the U.S. And that really, again, complicates the system. So I think your point is right that it matters. I just don't think for these countries it's likely to explain very much. That's all.
Yes, make your question brief because we don't have a lot of time.
Very quickly, the penetration data, I think you alluded to, is very dangerous. Yeah. Per bit of use secondly, the U.S. does have a lot more talk time than other countries, but consider this, we had 2.4 trillion minutes of use last year. 2.1 trillion of those minutes, middle school girls. You have a judge for that.
They count too.
That's a demographic anomaly. Very serious. I think
You made it up.
as a father of a middle school girl, however, I think it's third reality. Third, you mentioned in passing the weird U.S. pricing, or the weird wireless pricing pattern. The New York Times has got a wonderful story on this. I'm dazzled by the fact that people think this is weird. Okay, you've got a network, lots of sunk fixed costs, and you've got zero marginal costs up to capacity. And so this is post-1946. This is a marginal cost controversy. This is inducing people to pay fixed recurring charges to support the network, and then mass just dumping free off-peak minutes, free on-net minutes, free FAB 5 minutes, other services. Just dump that stuff so that you can get those recurring charges on there. There's no distortion. It's a wonderful example of efficient pricing. And this is the Apple Werner mistake. The network understands, yes, marginal cost at the margin for the price, but don't charge margin for pricing equal to marginal cost. You can't have it do.
As you know, I agree with you. I did not say the U.S. system is weird. I just said it's different, and obviously the U.S. system is much closer to being an efficient system than taxing use for the purpose of paying the fixed cost, which is the way almost everybody else in the world does it. I did want to say something actually about a paper Tom wrote a couple of years ago, which is important. I was going to mention it, but I forgot. Tom did a paper on wireless spectrum in Latin America, and one of the things that he pointed out was that there's way too little spectrum allocated to it. That is to say, when they do construct an auction, and even if they create a competitive industry, it's still the case that the amount of spectrum being allocated is low. And the purpose for that, of course, is to maximize the revenues, to create scarcity for the purpose of extracting the Ricardian rents from the spectrum. And one of the things that is not in Coase 1959, and that I don't think any of us thought carefully about when we were recommending spectrum auctions, is why would you believe that once you gave a revenue-generating mechanism to the government like this, they wouldn't just exercise their monopoly power? And indeed, a lot of the variation one observes in usage and penetration in not only Latin America, but all developing countries, has to do with the degree to which the government created artificial scarcity in the spectrum for the purpose of maximizing revenues.
Roger, did your data on price include in the Mexican case the fact that you had to buy 3 phones, pay all these different costs?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get it.
You have prices up there. I'm just asking you because they make the price to explain things.
Well, that's an individual, those are for each individual phone. And so the guy who buys 3 to be able to call at low marginal prices on each of the 3 networks is paying, would in theory be paying 3 times that, but it wouldn't really be that, because the way the price, that's why the price bundles are not useful as an indicator of price. The reason you would buy 3 telephones is to avoid the proportion of those monthly fees that's accounted for by use charges across networks. And since if you have a genuinely competitive wireless industry with 4 or 5 firms in it, most of your calls are going to be across network. And if you also have high usage, if you're using 100 or 200 minutes a month, that gives you a sufficient incentive to have multiple phones. Remember, the way that most phones are sold in the world is called prepaid, which is you buy a phone at an incredibly cheap price, like $5 or $10, and then you buy prepaid use per month up to a certain number of minutes, and then when you've used those minutes, the phone stops working. All right, and that mechanism is in place, explains why poor people have cell phones in developing countries. They buy really cheap, simple phones and prepaid service that limits their calling. And those are the guys who are actually dominating those numbers that produce the price data. It's their usage patterns that are dictating this.
Not you.
Now that you've thought it, the question, Roger, is when you start talking about the interconnection fees, it's quite clear, or interconnection arrangements, it's quite clear that it's critical. How many of these things have simple reciprocity arrangements where I get to your network and you get to my network, where the size differential may make a difference? And how many of them have explicit pricing with respect to connections?
There's 3 ways to deal with it. The first way is bill and keep, which is that it's exactly what you said. We don't worry about that because we figured the number of incoming calls versus outgoing calls will be pretty much the same on every network, and we just don't worry about it. That's a very small number of countries. We happen to live in one, and thank God. So that's a very small number. Then the second mechanism is that there's a cost-based regulatory price, and a regulator determines what a reasonable cost for termination would be. Usually, that's only 2 or 3 times what the actual cost is, all right? Which is really cheap compared to the third alternative, which is you let the carriers negotiate what it is. In Mexico, for example, the regulator in Mexico, which is actually very intelligent as a regulatory agency, they have some really good people on it, they just have no authority. And they have actually estimated the cost of terminating access in Mexico, and it's roughly 0.3 cents per minute. The regulated price is about 2.5 cents for termination on Telmex's wireline. But across the wireless carriers, since there isn't a dominant firm, they're not allowed to regulate it. And there, the termination price is about 14 cents because it's a cartelized price.
That's it. Thank you very much.